Now, you're cited as one of the most popular secretaries of state among members of the Foreign Service. What do you think that it was that you did to work so well with them?
Well, I didn't come in with an entourage. And I'd had the experience of 3 previous cabinet jobs where I had found that the career people, if you work with them, they'll work with you, and they know a lot. After all, they've been around. So I worked with them. And I also had the experience, having worked at Bechtel, private company, and watching the development of leadership there. Steve Bechtel was a master. He spent a huge amount of time trying to find out who are the talented young people around here and what do they need to have happen to them to develop themselves. So I had that same idea. The Foreign Service are talented people, and they need experience, and they need learning experiences to develop. So I worked at that. And one of the things I did that worked out well, having a university background, there was something called the Foreign Service Institute that everybody said was great. I said, I want to get exposed to it. They said, well, I'll come over and talk to you. I said, no, I want to go to where they are and see there. So I was in some nondescript office building across the Potomac. No doubt they were doing good work, but I said, this place sends a message that we don't put a lot of value on this subject. So by chance, the Army, I think it was the Army, abandoned some big place they had just across the river. And we got it. And we got some appropriations that I kind of sequestered so nobody could take it for something else. We developed it into a nice campus for training. And we moved all the stuff there. And it was good because it showed, we think the development of our young people into better is important to do, and it shows it.
You're a Marine yourself. Did the attack on the Marine barracks in Beirut change your view on the use of American troops in foreign policy?
No, it was the worst day of my life. But that was not a classic use of force. It was a peacekeeping mission. And it blew up.
So it did not change your view?
No. Actually, in the Reagan period, we were strong, but we hardly ever used force.
Hardly ever used force.
Hardly ever. Only 3 times, and none of those were big. But we had strength. There's a difference between strength and force. Force is a way you try to develop strength, and sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. But strength itself is something different, and can often be gotten by things not having use of force at all. Having a strong economy and a way about you. And in the Reagan period, we had a long negotiation over what were called intermediate nuclear forces. And we had an agreement in NATO that if the negotiations didn't succeed, we would deploy our own. The Soviets had deployed them. And we worked hard, the negotiations didn't succeed, and we proceeded with deployments. It was a huge thing. The Soviets got war talk and scaring everybody, but we managed to get our missiles deployed. And it was a show of strength. Actually, I think it was kind of a turning point in the Cold War. We were able to do that. But not a shot was fired, but it was very important strength.
So you're talking about in the early 80s, the Soviets deployed these SS-20 nuclear missiles in an effort to drive apart the alliance between the United States and Europe. And there were these mass anti-nuclear demonstrations in capitals around Europe. How did we manage to keep this alliance together and still deploy these missiles?
Well, we had very close consultation with our allies. And as our negotiations were proceeding, we talked to them about what was going on and what our thinking was. And we changed our position from time to time, but they were very much a party to it all. Mm-hmm. And whenever I went to Moscow, I'd always stop in Brussels and meet with my counterparts, and when I got through, I'd always report. So they were very much in the picture all the time. Mm-hmm. And then the fact that it was clear that our negotiations were in good faith helped.
In 1983, the Soviets shoot down this Korean Airlines flight with dozens of American citizens on board. Why did we not decide to break off negotiations with the Soviets?
Well, in that case, we had, and I read it out publicly, the transcript of the conversation between the pilot who shot the plane down and his ground control. And we knew that some time elapsed between his first contact, so ground control was in touch with somebody we didn't know who. So I read out that. So we led the outrage and the effort to get the communications system that would keep planes on track. But I went ahead with a meeting that I had scheduled with Gromyko. We went ahead with our arms control negotiations. That was a break with the concept of linkage. There was the concept that if anything happened bad in one place, it would affect everything.
That was used under President Nixon.
It was used, well, the outstanding example was President Carter when they invaded Afghanistan.
With the Olympics.
He cut off, our athletes couldn't go to the Olympics. He withdrew a treaty and Gromyko would not be invited to Washington when it came to the General Assembly and everything. So that turned out badly because we had no contact. And that's what I inherited. But I had lots of contact with the Soviets when I was Secretary of the Treasury. So I had more of a baseline of dealing with them than anybody else did. So we started a different pattern. And the fact that we broke with the concept of linkage in order to keep negotiations going, when it came to the hard time as we were going to deploy these missiles, the fact that we had demonstrated our genuine effort to try to get a negotiated settlement was one of the reasons why we were able to get deployment.
What kind of role did the concept of the Strategic Defense Initiative play in our negotiations with the Soviets?
Well, it turned out to be a matter of great leverage with the Soviets. They had a view that we were further along than we actually were, and it was preoccupying to them. And we could see at Reykjavik meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev, huge concessions on their part, which was all conditioned on what we regarded as scrapping SDI, which we wouldn't do. But nevertheless, the progress made at Reykjavik on the intermediate range missiles and the street eventually became treaties. So we got there.
So this Reykjavik summit between President Reagan and Gorbachev, and you were there, which failed to produce an agreement, how did that lead to the eventual success the next year of actual treaty of nuclear weapons reduction?
Well, in Reykjavik, in effect, we saw their bottom line. So we could negotiate knowing that and eventually got to where we wanted to get. At the Reykjavik meeting, all of the publicity was about the arms control discussions and the proposal that we get rid of nuclear weapons entirely. But at the same time, there was a negotiation involving my Assistant Secretary Roz Ridgway, and Besmertnik was the name of the guy on the Soviet side. And they agreed for the first time in a formal way that human rights would be a recognized regular item on our agenda. And that was a very important development.
What were the differences, in your opinion, between negotiating with the Soviets and negotiating with the Chinese?
Well, I haven't really thought about it, but negotiations are negotiations. You have to analyze what the situation is with each country. It's a different pattern. Actually, when I was in office, my first meeting I went over and I met with Deng Xiaoping and my counterpart Wu Chi-chen. And I took a different approach, which they liked. I said, you put on the table everything you want to talk about, and I'll do the same. And then we'll make this into an agenda. And then we'll work our way through that agenda. And I will agree to come here at least once a year. And Wu Chi-Chen will agree to come to the United States at least once a year. And we go to the same meetings 2 or 3 times a year, and we'll agree at each one of those times to cut out, say, 3 hours. It's just us. We'll work our way through that agenda. And they like that approach, sort of workmanlike and straightforward. And I got to know Wu Chi-Chen pretty well, and so I said to him, they always put me up in the state guest house in Beijing, and our meetings were mostly in the Great Hall. So I said to him one time, I understand that China is a big country, but as far as I'm concerned, it consists of 2 buildings and a road between them. That's all you ever let me see. So we spent a week, he took me a week tour of China. It was lots of fun. One of the things that I learned from that, we were in Shenzhen. In Shenzhen, there is an acre or 2 that is a kind of replica of China, as you can walk around China. And then there were a whole bunch of maybe 8 kitchens. And you say Chinese food, but what I saw in the 8 kitchens, there are 8 different kinds of Chinese food. It's not all the same. So you see the diversity in China that people don't appreciate.
Mm-hmm. To what extent did your ability to work with the Chinese play a role in ending the Cold War with the Soviet Union?
Well, the Chinese could see that their interests were being taken into account. For instance, in the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, for a while the Soviets proposed to take all of them out that were aimed at Europe, but leave the ones in Asia there. So they were pointed at Japan and China. And we, in the end, we insisted, no, they all have to go. So they could see their interests we were taking into account in our negotiation. They appreciated that.
Mm-hmm. In your view, what were the major factors that caused the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
Well, I think it was fundamentally based on ideas that didn't work. For instance, they had a collective farm situation, and we could see that the yields from what they did were pitiful compared with what normal. When I was Secretary of the Treasury, the President opened our markets to them, and we had some problems with that. So I decided I wanted to find out more about what their crops were, so I had a better idea how much buying they would do. And so we had pictures, and we saw what they planted and what they got. And I took it to our agricultural experts, and they were appalled at the yields. So collective farming didn't work. If you have incentivized individual farming, it works much better. Mm-hmm. And my late wife was a nurse, so she would often be asked if she would go to this hospital or that. And she'd get back and she'd say, I could hardly wait to get out because the sanitary conditions aren't anywhere near what would be acceptable in one of our hospitals. So well, the medical system had its flaws and so on. So I think there was a big argument. The George F. Kennan long telegram said, if we contain the Soviet Union long enough, their internal problems will cause them to want to change. Over time, that got supplanted by what was called détente, which basically said, they're there, we're here, that's life. The name of the game is to avoid a conflict. Well, I don't quarrel with that, but I do quarrel with the idea of we're here, they're there, because they were not going to last, I didn't think. And neither did President Reagan. But a lot of people thought otherwise.